I'd written worse leads before. Woman assigned to comms platoon, human interest, 500 words, page 9. That was the note I'd scratched in my notebook the morning I met her, and I want it on the record now because it tells you exactly how wrong a man can be standing 3 feet from the truth. Her name, as far as the roster board at the FOB was concerned, was Petty Officer Denholm. Commo and logistics, attached. Nobody said much else about her, which in a place like that is its own kind of statement. The platoon had 31 confirmed deployments between them stitched into their sleeves, and the particular hollow look men get after they've lost someone recently and haven't said so out loud. I'd been embedded 11 days by then, chasing a different story, a river crossing, a stalled resupply line, the usual grinding arithmetic of a war nobody back home was reading about anymore. And she was, to my eye, background. A woman with a headset and a laptop case, sitting apart from the rest at chow, eating like she was on a clock even when she wasn't. I introduced myself the way I introduced myself to everyone, which is to say badly, half listening, already composing the next question in my head. She shook my hand once, firm, said Denholm, and went back to her food. I remember thinking she seemed tired in a specific way, not sleep-deprived tired, but tired like someone holding something heavy and choosing not to set it down where people could see the shape of it. Lieutenant Commander Hale ran the platoon the way I'd seen a dozen platoon commanders run platoons, competent, clipped, carrying a weight of his own that he wore like armor. 3 months earlier, his unit had lost a man in a compound clearance that went bad on paper in ways that still weren't fully explained, and you could see it sitting behind his eyes whenever the room got quiet. He didn't talk about Denholm much, and when he did, it was administrative. She's here for commo redundancy. Keep her on the net, keep her off the line. I wrote that down too because it seemed like a decent detail for the story I thought I was writing, a piece about the invisible women who kept these units running, radios and logistics, unglamorous and essential, the sort of thing that wins you a kind editor's note and not much else. I didn't know yet that commo redundancy was, in the strictest technical sense, a cover story approved 4 levels up a chain most of the men in that room would never see the top of. The mess tent sat at the edge of the compound, canvas gone the color of old rust from dust and sun, 3 long tables and a coffee urn that never seemed to run dry no matter how bad the resupply got. It was there, on my 3rd evening, that I watched a petty officer named Briggs throw the better part of a cup of instant coffee in Denholm's face. It wasn't a dramatic scene, not at first. Briggs was a big man, 26 or 27, good-looking in the way recruiting posters like, and popular with the junior guys in the way loud men often are. He'd been ribbing her for 2 days about the radio checks, nothing that would get written up, just a steady drip of the radio girl says, whenever he wanted a laugh. Ask the radio girl, she'll know, when someone mentioned anything logistical. That evening he'd been drinking near beer and telling a story about the compound clearance that got the platoon's last KIA, a story he had no real business telling with that much bravado, and Denholm, quiet the whole meal, said 4 words. I remember them exactly, because they were the first real thing I'd heard her say. That's not what happened. The tent went quiet in that particular way tents go quiet when someone junior has said something a senior man doesn't want said. Briggs turned in his seat, coffee cup still in hand, and asked her, genuinely asked her, like it was a real question, what a radio girl would know about it. She didn't answer. She looked at him the way you'd look at a storm you'd already priced into your afternoon. And that was somehow worse to him than an answer would have been, because he stood up, said something about her needing to learn her place on this platoon, and threw what was left of his coffee across the table into her face. It wasn't a big amount. It didn't burn her, the coffee had gone lukewarm an hour before. But I watched 22 men in that tent watch it happen and not one of them said a word, and I watched Denholm sit perfectly still with coffee dripping off her jaw and her collar, and not move to wipe it away for 3 full seconds, like she was giving the room a chance to be better than it was being. Nobody took it. She stood, finally, unhurried, picked up a napkin, wiped her face with the same economy she did everything, and said, "Copy that," in a voice with no heat in it at all, which somehow landed harder than shouting would have. Then she walked out. Hale had been at the far table. He'd seen it. He said nothing to Briggs that night. What he did the next morning was call Denholm into the command tent and tell her that for the push into Karun Crossing, she'd stay on commo only, no combat load, no rifle beyond her sidearm, radio net, and nothing else. When she asked why, flat, not pleading, he told her the platoon didn't need the distraction. I was standing close enough to hear it because I'd gone looking for a quote about the coffee incident, something I could use to color the human interest piece I was still, foolishly, planning to write. "Copy that," she said again, same voice, and went to check her radios. I want to tell you I saw something in her eyes in that moment, some flicker of the woman I'd meet by nightfall the next day, but the honest truth is I didn't. I saw a woman absorbing an insult with the kind of discipline that looked, to my untrained eye, like resignation. I wrote in my notebook that evening, D taking it on the chin. Good color, sympathetic, no real story here beyond the obvious one. I was a war correspondent with 11 years in, and I had read her completely wrong. And I want that on the record too, because what happened at Karun Crossing the next day is going to sound, if I'm not honest about my own blindness first, like something I invented to make a better ending. Karun Crossing wasn't much of a town by the time we rolled into it. A scatter of collapsed apartment blocks along a river crossing that had changed hands 4 times in 18 months. A pharmacy with half its roof caved into the street. A scattering of civilians who'd mostly learned to disappear when the trucks came through. Command wanted the platoon to secure the crossing point long enough for an engineer element to shore up a bridge span that kept the resupply line alive. It was supposed to be, in the flat language these things always get described in beforehand, a low-intensity presence operation. It went wrong in the way these things go wrong, not all at once, but in a series of small wrongnesses that added up before anyone could name the pattern. A boy who watched the convoy too long from a doorway. A silence in the second block that the point man didn't like the feel of. Hale calling a halt to reassess, and the halt itself becoming the thing that let the ambush set. I was in the second vehicle, notebook in my lap, when the first rounds came in from the collapsed pharmacy block, and the platoon scattered into the rubble the way trained men scatter, fast, low, ugly, alive. I went down behind a chunk of masonry with my heart going somewhere it had gone only twice before in my career, and it was there, in the dust and the noise, that I first understood I had badly misjudged Petty Officer Denholm. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't even hurrying, particularly. While rounds cracked off the rubble around us and men shouted range and direction at each other in the clipped code of people who'd trained for exactly this, she was moving along the low wall with her eyes doing something none of the rest of us were doing, reading. Reading the angles of fire, reading the collapse pattern of the pharmacy's second floor, reading, I'd learn later, a hairline stress crack running through a load-bearing column that told her more about the building's next 30 seconds than any of us could have guessed from looking at it. She caught my eye once briefly and said, not unkindly, "Stay low, stay put," and moved on. And I did exactly that, because in that particular second there was nobody on the street I trusted more. The building she was watching went, not in the dramatic collapse of a film, but in the sagging, groaning way real concrete gives, a slow lean, then a chest-deep boom that punched through the noise of gunfire, and the pharmacy's second floor came down into the street in a gray wave that swallowed the enemy position whole. 2 of the shooters who'd been working from a window up there died in it. The rest scattered into the block behind. And for a moment the ambush's rhythm broke. "Fall back to the wall line," Hale was shouting, his voice cutting through the settling dust, and the platoon began the ugly business of consolidating, dragging back, covering each other in twos, the particular choreography of men who had rehearsed this exact motion 100 times in training, and were now doing it for real with their hearts in their throats. Denholm moved with them, still unhurried, still reading. I saw her stop twice. Once to glance at a wounded corporal being dragged by his vest, assessing something in his face I couldn't read. Once to look back at the collapsed pharmacy, with an expression I can only describe as professional interest, the way an engineer looks at a bridge that held. We made it to a shattered block of apartments on the north side of the crossing, 4 stories, half of it caved in on itself from some earlier fight, the rest standing in the stubborn, wounded way concrete stands when it has decided not to fall yet. It was there the platoon got properly pinned. The enemy had a second position we hadn't accounted for, dug into a raised embankment on the far side of the river with a clean line down the main street, and every attempt to move toward the extraction point drew fire that told you, in the flat mathematics of combat, exactly how much they wanted that crossing held. Ammunition ran the way it always runs in a fight that goes long, faster than anyone wants to admit out loud. I heard the calls going up and down the line, terse, professional, the particular controlled panic of men doing the arithmetic in their heads. Briggs, 20 feet from me, called out that he was down to 2 mags. Someone else called out he was dry. And somewhere in the middle of that accounting, I heard Hale's voice, tighter than I'd heard it yet, ask Denholm, over the radio formally, like it mattered that it be on the record, what her ammunition status was. "Last round," she said, flat, not a complaint, a fact delivered the way she delivered everything. There was a silence on that channel that I felt more than heard, 3 seconds, maybe 4. And in it, I watched Lieutenant Commander Hale do something I would not have predicted from the man who'd benched her the morning before for being a distraction. He was pinned behind a chunk of stairwell wall 20 feet from her, his own weapon still half loaded, and he looked at her, really looked, the way you look at someone when a decision has stopped being about protocol and started being about survival, and he unslung his M4, checked it was hot, and threw it. Across 8 feet of open, fired on street. To her. It should not have worked. It was, on the face of it, an insane thing to do, a commander disarming himself in the middle of a firefight to hand a rifle to the person he'd told, less than 24 hours earlier, wasn't cleared to carry one. I heard Briggs shout something, a protest, a curse, I couldn't tell which. What I remember clearly is that Denholm caught the rifle out of the air with both hands, checked it in under a second. I watched her thumb find the selector. Her eye confirmed the chamber. A motion so practiced it barely registered as motion at all, and came up into a firing position against the stairwell's broken edge like she'd been born doing it. What she did with that rifle over the next 90 seconds is the part of this I've told fewer times than any other, because it's the part people least believe, and because I understand now, having watched it, why the men who doubted her went as quiet as they did. She didn't spray. She didn't even move much. She found the embankment position. I never did see exactly how. The light was bad and the dust hadn't settled. And she put rounds into it with a rhythm that had nothing frantic in it at all. 3 shots. A pause to read what the pause bought her. 2 more. I counted later from the after-action account. 9 rounds. 4 confirmed hits on positions that had been suppressing the whole platoon for 6 minutes straight, the enemy fire from that embankment dropping by more than half inside the first 30 seconds and going silent inside the second. Briggs, beside me, had stopped cursing. He was watching her the way you watch whether you don't have a name for. But the rifle wasn't the thing that saved the platoon. The rifle bought us 90 seconds. What Denholm did with those 90 seconds was the part that told me, finally, who she actually was. She'd clocked something the rest of us hadn't. A second enemy element working around the collapsed apartment block's east side, using a service alley between 2 buildings as a covered approach to flank the platoon's position entirely. I heard her call it to Hale over the net, calm, precise, giving him bearing and distance like she was reading off a checklist. And then, instead of falling back with the rest of the line the way protocol would have called for, she moved low, fast, alone, toward the alley itself, toward the exact spot the flanking element intended to use. I found out afterward what she'd seen that none of the rest of us had the training to see. The alley ran beneath the corner of the apartment block's east wing, a section of the structure already stressed by the earlier fighting, its foundation cracked along a fault line that a combat engineer's eye reads the way a doctor reads an X-ray. She had roughly 90 seconds, a rifle she'd been holding for 2 minutes, and whatever was left in the abandoned engineer's cache the platoon had passed on their way in, a half crate of demolition charges meant for the bridge work, sitting exactly where the morning's engineer element had left it when the ambush scattered them. She used 4 charges. I watched her set them from a distance, working with the unhurried, methodical hands of someone doing a job she had done 100 times before under worse conditions than this. And when she gave the countdown over the net, flat, precise, 3 words, fire in the hole, the east wing of that apartment block came down across the alley's mouth in a controlled fold that sealed the flanking route under 20 feet of rubble, and killed the momentum of the entire enemy assault in one motion. Nobody was caught beneath it who shouldn't have been. She had timed it, I understood later, to the second, watching the flanking elements approach speed the whole time she was setting charges, waiting until they were committed to the alley and no one else was. It was the kind of thing that looks in the moment like luck. It is not luck. I have covered enough of these wars to know the difference between a man who got lucky and a man, or, in this case, a woman who read a battlefield the way the rest of us read a newspaper, calmly, completely, 3 moves ahead. What she did in that alley was not a miracle. It was a problem she had already solved before most of us had finished being afraid. The extraction, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic by comparison. A clean fighting withdrawal to the crossing point. The bridge held long enough for the engineer element to finish its work. Casualties light and none of them fatal, which in a fight that had opened as badly as this one had is its own kind of miracle, earned rather than given. I remember the walk back to the vehicles more clearly than almost anything else that day, because it was there that I watched 12 men who had spent 2 days calling her, the radio girl, go quiet in a way I have rarely seen grown men go quiet. Hale found her first. He was bleeding from a graze along his forearm he hadn't mentioned to anyone, his own rifle back in his hands, his, slung now over her shoulder with the ease of something that had always belonged there. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and then Lieutenant Commander Hale, a man who had lost a soldier 3 months earlier and carried it like a stone in his chest every day since, came to attention in the middle of a dust-choked street and saluted her. I don't think he knew in that instant exactly who she was, not the citations, not the rank that would come out in the debrief that evening, not the 3 separate commendations for ordnance work under fire that had been sitting quietly in a file above his security clearance. He knew what he had watched. He knew she had solved, with a stolen 90 seconds and a rifle he'd given up his own safety to hand her, a problem that would have gotten men under his command killed. That was enough. He held the salute until she returned it, and when she did, there was nothing performative in it, no triumph, just the same flat competence she'd carried through the whole ugly day. Briggs came up behind him a moment later, and I watched a big, loud, popular young man do something that cost him visibly more than the salute had cost his commander. He didn't say much. He held out a cup of coffee from his own canteen, offered with both hands, the same gesture in miniature reverse of what he'd done to her the night before, and said, "I owe you that back, ma'am, and an apology if you'll take it." She looked at him for a long moment, not unkindly, not with any particular warmth either, just with the same clear-eyed assessment she'd given the pharmacy roof before it came down, and took the coffee. "Copy that," she said, and this time the 2 words carried something entirely different than they had in the mess tent. I got the full picture that evening, in the command tent, in the flat administrative language of an after-action debrief that somehow made the day's events sound smaller than they'd been. Senior Chief Petty Officer Mara Denholm, Naval Special Warfare, master explosive ordnance technician and qualified combat engineer. 3 separate commendations for high-risk disposal work under direct fire. Attached to Hale's platoon under a commo cover at the direction of command 4 levels above his own. Sent in quietly, after the compound clearance that had cost the platoon a man, to assess whether the unit's readiness had survived what it had lost. Nobody had told Hale that last part. I don't think anyone was ever going to tell him until the day it mattered. Her call sign, logged on channels most of the platoon had never had clearance to hear, was Anvil. I asked her later why. She was cleaning the rifle that wasn't hers, methodical as always, and she didn't look up when she answered. "Because you put the hard thing on it," she said, "and it doesn't move." That was the whole explanation. It was, I've come to think, the truest thing anyone said to me the entire deployment. I flew out of that region 3 weeks later with a story that had nothing to do with the one I'd planned to write. I'd meant to write about the invisible women who keep these units running, radios and logistics, unglamorous and essential. I wrote instead about a senior chief petty officer who let a room full of men underestimate her for 2 days because the mission required it, who took a cup of coffee in the face without flinching and a rifle out of the air without hesitating, and who taught 12 men in the space of 90 seconds what the word anvil actually meant. Hale still commands men, last I heard, a different platoon now, further along in a career that survived a bad compound clearance and came out the other side steadier for it. I don't know if he ever told the men under him what he learned that day at Karun Crossing. I like to think he did. I know Briggs did, because I heard him tell it once, years later, at a reunion I covered almost by accident. The same story, nearly word for word, except by then he told it on himself, the way a man tells a story about the worst thing he ever did in order to make sure he never does it again. As for Anvil, she went back to the work she'd always done, the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of taking apart the things that are built to kill people, one careful motion at a time, in places that will never put her name on a headline. I've thought about her more than almost anyone else I met in 11 years of covering this war. Not because of the rifle, and not because of the alley, though God knows both of those earned their place in the story. I think about her because of the 3 seconds she sat still with coffee dripping off her jaw in that mess tent, giving a room full of men a chance to be better than they were being, and because none of them took it, and because, when it mattered, she saved every one of them anyway. There's a piece of that day I left out of the first version of this dispatch, and I want to put it back in now, because it belongs, and because I think I left it out the first time for a reason that says more about me than about her. Before the debrief, before Hale's salute, before any of it, there was the wounded corporal, a 19-year-old named Ellis Cade, dragged back from the initial contact with a fragment wound high in his thigh, close enough to the artery that the corpsman treating him had gone quiet in the particular way corpsmen go quiet when they're doing math they don't want to say out loud. I was crouched near enough to hear it. The corpsman, a second class named Ruiz, had the wound packed and was fighting the bleeding with the flat, controlled urgency of a man losing a fight slowly. And it was in the middle of that, in the middle of the ambush still very much alive around us, that Denholm crossed to him. She didn't take over. That's the detail I want on the record because it would have been easy to write it that way, the competent woman sweeping in to fix what the corpsman couldn't. That isn't what happened. She knelt beside Ruiz, said 4 words, pressure point, 2 inches higher, and put her own hand where his hand needed to be a beat sooner than his exhaustion was letting him get there, freeing him to work the packing instead of splitting his attention between the two. It took maybe 6 seconds. She was gone again a moment later, back to reading the building line, and Ruiz told me afterward, in the flat, unadorned way soldiers describe things that scared them, that those 6 seconds were the difference between Cade keeping the leg and not. I asked her about it that evening in the command tent, while she was field stripping the rifle that still wasn't hers. She shrugged in the small, economical way she did everything. "You spend enough years around ordnance," she said. You learn a lot about where a body bleeds from and how fast. It's the same math as a charge, where the pressure needs to go and how much time you've got before it doesn't matter anymore. She said it the way another person might describe changing a tire. I wrote it down anyway, because I understood, even then, that I was listening to someone whose entire life had been built out of exactly that kind of pressure, knowing where the dangerous thing was, and what it would cost if she got the timing wrong. The debrief itself, which I'd flattened into a paragraph of administrative language in my first pass at this story, because it felt easier to summarize than to sit inside, deserves better than that, so let me put you in the room. It was a canvas tent lit by 2 work lamps running off a generator that hummed loud enough you had to lean in to hear each other clearly. Hale sat at the head of a folding table with his forearm freshly dressed, still in his gear, and beside him sat a man I hadn't seen before that evening. A commander 2 ranks above Hale's own, flown in on the same bird that would take the wounded out, introduced to the room only as Captain Ray's, Naval Special Warfare Group liaison. It was Ray's who read Denholm's actual assignment into the record, and it was watching Hale's face while he did it that told me more about the day than anything I'd witnessed in the street. Senior Chief Petty Officer Mara Denholm, Ray's read, flat and procedural, the way these things are always read, attached under operational cover, tasked with assessment of Platoon 26's combat readiness and command cohesion following the loss of Petty Officer First Class Munro on the 11th of March. He said it without looking up from the folder, the way you'd read weather. Hale's jaw did something small and controlled, the muscle at the hinge tightening once and releasing. Munro. I hadn't heard the name before that evening. Nobody had said it to me directly in 11 days of living alongside these men, though I'd felt its absence the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. A silence that sat under half the platoon's jokes and none of its stories. You were sent to evaluate whether we'd fall apart, Hale said. It wasn't quite a question. I was sent to find out, Denholm said. Whether you'd hold, there's a difference. She was still cleaning the rifle. She didn't look up either, and I understood in that moment that this was not for her a dramatic disclosure. It was a job report, delivered with the same flat competence she'd used to call range and bearing on an enemy position an hour earlier. For what it's worth, Commander, you held. Ray's closed the folder. The Chief's report to Group is going to say the same thing. For the record, Platoon 26 is fit for continued tasking. That assessment stands regardless of anything discussed in this tent tonight. He looked at Hale for a long moment, and something passed between the two of them that I wasn't senior enough in any sense to be fully let into, a professional courtesy, maybe, or an acknowledgement that a hard thing had been tested honestly, and the platoon had passed it in the worst possible way, under real fire, with real cost, instead of on some evaluator's checklist in a safe room. You'll get the full write-up through channels. I'd suggest, off the record, that you tell your men the truth about who was standing next to them today. They earned that. Hale nodded slowly. Then he did something that surprised me more than the salute in the street had. He asked her, directly, whether Munro's death could have gone differently if she'd been assigned to the platoon before it happened instead of after. I watched her consider the question with the same seriousness she gave everything, and I watched her choose deliberately not to give him the easy answer. I don't know, she said. I wasn't there. I don't do that math on things I didn't see, Commander, and neither should you. What I can tell you is what I saw today, which is a platoon that read a bad situation fast and covered each other without hesitating once. That's not luck. That's training, and it's yours. It was, I think, the kindest thing anyone said in that tent all evening, and it was delivered without a shred of softness in the voice, which somehow made it land harder than sympathy would have. Outside the tent later, I found Briggs sitting alone on an ammunition crate, turning his coffee cup over in his hands without drinking from it. He'd been quiet since the street, which for a man who filled every silence he'd ever met was its own kind of confession. You writing about today? He asked me. I told him I was. Write that I was an idiot, he said. Don't dress it up. I threw a drink in a senior chief's face because I decided, on no evidence at all, that a quiet woman with a headset couldn't know anything I didn't already know. Write that down exactly like that. He looked at the cup in his hands. My old man was career Army. He used to say the fastest way to get people killed is deciding you already know who's dangerous and who isn't before you've bothered to find out. I heard him say it 100 times growing up, and I still needed a woman half my size to hold a choke point with my commander's rifle before it actually landed. He finally drank the coffee, grimaced. It had gone cold again, the second cup he hadn't managed to finish that day, and gave a short laugh with no real humor in it. Some lessons you've got to pay full price for, I guess. I asked him if he thought he'd remember it. Every time somebody quiet walks into a room from now on, he said, yeah, I think I will. He was right, as it turned out, though neither of us knew it that night. I told you earlier that I heard him tell this story on himself, years later, at a reunion. What I didn't tell you is that by then he was a chief himself, training junior sailors of his own, and the version of the story he told them wasn't really about Denholm at all by that point. It was about the 3 seconds he'd let pass in a mess tent, while a woman sat still with coffee on her face, waiting to see if anyone in the room would be decent, and how he thought about those 3 seconds nearly every day of his career afterward, because they were the cheapest, ugliest thing he'd ever done in uniform. And the fact that she'd saved his life anyway less than 24 hours later was a mercy he said he never felt he'd fully earned. I want to close, properly this time, on something Denholm said to me on my last morning at that fob, 3 weeks after Karun Crossing, when I came to ask if there was anything she wanted added or corrected in the piece before I filed it. She'd read an early draft, a courtesy I don't often extend, but felt she'd earned, and handed it back to me with almost nothing marked on it. Just one line circled near the end, where I'd written that she'd proven herself to the platoon. I didn't prove anything to them, she said. I did my job. The proving was always theirs to do, whether they'd treat the quiet person in the room like she might know something worth listening to. Some of them did the work. Some of them are still doing it. She handed the page back. Write it that way if you're going to write it at all. I did eventually, though it took me years to get the balance right, and I suspect this version still isn't the one she'd have chosen. But I think about that circled line more than almost anything else from 11 years of covering that war. The idea that the burden of proof was never really hers to carry, that it belonged, the whole time, to the men standing close enough to see her clearly and choosing or failing to look. Some of them looked. 12 of them, in the space of 90 seconds on a shattered street in a town most maps don't bother to name, finally did. And they never called her the radio girl again.